Hey guys, haven't done one of these in a while, so just want to go ahead and do one. I'm going to read some of my history course to you. This is American history. We are in the Second World War. I'm sitting here in my car reading aloud by myself, so I just thought it'd be nice to share with you guys. That's a nice thing to do. Anyway, so this is after D-Day. Germany is waning. They're pretty much toast. And now it's just kind of figuring the rest of the stuff out to end the war. So the section's called Death of a President. By early 1945, Nazi Germany was on the verge of defeat, but 63-year-old Franklin Roosevelt, U.S. President, would not live to join the victory celebrations. In the spring of 1945, he went to the Little White House in Warm Springs, Georgia. On April 12, 1945, just 82 days into his fourth term, he complained of a headache but seemed to be in good spirits. It was nearly lunchtime when he said to an artist painting his portrait, "Now we've got just about 15 minutes more to work." Then, while reading some documents, Roosevelt groaned, saying that he had a terrific pain in the back of his head. He slumped over, fell into a coma, and died 2 hours later. Very sad. The only president to ever serve 4 terms, I believe. On hand to witness the president's death was Lucy Mercer Rutherford, the woman with whom Roosevelt had had an affair 30 years before. Eleanor Roosevelt was in Washington, D.C. when Franklin died, unaware of the president's guest. Although Franklin had promised in 1918 to end all communications with Mercer, he had in fact secretly stayed in touch, even enabling her to attend his presidential inauguration in 1933. Roosevelt's death shocked and saddened the world. Even his sharpest critics were devastated. Ohio Senator Robert Taft, known as Mr. Republican, said the president's death removes the greatest figure of our time at the very climax of his career. He dies a hero of the war, for he literally worked himself to death in the service of the American people. Here's a picture of him in the middle there. I don't know how well you can see that. It's him in the middle. Looking kind of tired. The collapse of Nazism. Adolf Hitler's Nazi. Oh yeah. So I'm on page 1230, and I have to get to 12. I have to read through 1243. So I've got 13 more pages to read before class in 40 minutes. The collapse of Nazism. Adolf Hitler's Nazi Empire collapsed less than a month later. In Berlin on April 28th, as Soviet troops entered the German capital, Hitler married his mistress, Eva Braun, in an underground bunker. That same day, Italian freedom fighters captured Mussolini. Despite his plea to "let me live and I will give you an empire," Mussolini and his mistress were shot and hung by their heels from a girder above a Milan gas station. On April 30th, Hitler and his wife retired to their underground bedroom, where she poisoned herself and he put a bullet in his head. Their bodies were taken outside, doused with gasoline, and burned. Interesting. On May 2nd, a lot of people wonder about the death of Hitler. Did he die? Where was the body? Blah, blah, blah. Did he kill himself? Blah, blah, blah. On May 2nd, Berlin fell to the Soviet soldiers. Axis forces in Italy surrendered the same day. Five days later, on May 7th, the chief of staff of the German armed forces surrendered unconditionally. So ended the Nazi domination of Europe just over 12 years after Hitler had proclaimed his 1,000-year Reich. May 8th, VE Day, Victory in Europe, witnessed massive celebrations across the free world. In Paris, an American bomber pilot flew his plane through the arch of the Eiffel Tower. In New York City, 500,000 people celebrated in the streets. The elation, however, was tempered by the ongoing war against Japan and the immense challenges of helping Europe rebuild. The German economy had to be revived A new democratic government had to be formed, and millions of displaced Europeans had to be clothed, housed, and fed. The Holocaust. The end of the war in Europe revealed to the world the horrific extent of the Holocaust. Hitler's systematic program to destroy Jews and other minority groups he deemed unfit to live. In 1941, a German soldier wrote his wife, "The Jews are being completely exterminated." He reminded her not to tell their son about such atrocities. It took longer for the rest of the world to learn of the Holocaust. Reports of the Nazis' methodical slaughter of Jews had appeared as early as 1942. But ghastly stories of millions killed in gas chambers seemed beyond belief until the Allied armies liberated the Nazi death camps in Central and Eastern Europe. There, the Germans had imposed their final solution, the wholesale extermination of at least 6 million Jews and many millions more non-Jewish peoples. Winston Churchill called the Holocaust the most horrible crime ever committed in the history of the world. There's a picture here, not of the Holocaust, but of the celebration of the war ending. May 8, 1945, the celebration in New York's Times Square on VE Day was just one of many massive events held around the world to cheer the end of World War II. Bless me. The Allied troops were shocked at what they discovered in the extermination camps, where as many as 24,000 Jews a day had been killed. Bodies were piled as high as buildings. Survivors were living skeletons wrapped in skin. General Eisenhower reported that the things I saw beggar description. Everywhere, the starvation, cruelty, and bestiality were so overpowering as to leave me a bit sick. In one room where they were piled up, 20 or 30 naked men killed by starvation. General George Patton would not even enter. He said that he would get sick if he did so. I made the visit desperately in order, probably would have gotten sick. I made the visit deliberately in order to be in a position to give first-hand evidence of these things if ever in the future there develops a tendency to charge these allegations merely to propaganda. American army officers forced neighboring German villagers to tour the death camps so that there could be no denying what had gone on there. After doing so, the major of Dachau and his wife hanged themselves. American officials had dragged their feet in acknowledging the Holocaust for fear that relief efforts for Jewish refugees might stir up anti-Semitism at home. At the same time, several key figures in the State Department proved to be anti-Semitic themselves, and they balked at bringing more Jewish refugees to America. Holocaust survivors. American troops liberate survivors of the Buchenwald concentration camp in April 1945. Among the prisoners is Elie Wiesel, second row from bottom, seventh from the left. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, all. Who went on to become an author, professor, political activist, and recipient of the Nobel Prize. Robert Reynolds, a Democratic senator from North Carolina, expressed the prevailing view when he roared in a Senate speech that if I had my way, I would today build a wall about the United States so high and so secure that not a single alien or foreign refugee from any country upon the face of the earth could possibly scale or ascend it. In 1942, the Nazi-controlled Romanian government had offered to spare 70,000 Jews in death camps for a ransom of $50 each. The State Department had declined, prompting a young Treasury Department official, Josiah E. Dubois, Jr., to write a letter to protest. One of the greatest crimes in history, the slaughter of the Jewish people in Europe, is continuing unabated, he revealed. Dubois charged that the anti-Semitic members of the State Department were covering up Nazi atrocities. Prejudice against Jews was not limited to the state government. It was widespread from the United States. In 1938, a national poll asked, "What kind of people do you object to?" Jews were named most often. The nation's best colleges and universities applied quotas to Jewish applicants. Prestigious country clubs barred them from joining, and marriages between Jews and Christians were discouraged. Under pressure from Jewish groups and his wife, Roosevelt had created a war refugee board early in 1944 to rescue European Jews at risk of extermination. The War Refugee Board managed to rescue about 200,000 European Jews and some 20,000 other refugees. The Roosevelt administration, however, refused appeals from Jewish leaders to bomb the concentration camp at Auschwitz, Poland, arguing that doing so would kill many Jews, be ineffective, the Nazis would simply build another one, and distract resources from the priority of defeating Hitler's war machine. The Pacific War. 10 pages to go. For months after the attack on Pearl Harbor at the end of 1941, the news from the Pacific was all bad, as President Roosevelt acknowledged. With stunning speed, the Japanese had captured numerous territories in Asia, including the British colonies of Hong Kong, Burma, Malaya, and Singapore, and the French colony of Indochina, the Philippines. In the Philippines, U.S. forces and their Filipino allies were overwhelmed. On April 10, 1942, the Japanese gathered some 12,000 captured American troops along with 66,000 Filipinos and forced them to march 65 miles in 6 days up the Bataan Peninsula. Although underfed and ravaged by disease, the prisoners were brutalized in what came to be known as the Bataan Death March. Those who fell out of line were bayoneted or shot. Others were beaten, stabbed, or shot for no reason. More than 10,000 prisoners died along the way. News of the Bataan Death March outraged Americans and contributed to the Pacific War's emotional intensity and mutual atrocities. By the summer of 1942, Japan was on the verge of assaulting Australia when its naval leaders succumbed to what one admiral called victory disease. Intoxicated with easy victories and lusting for more, they pushed into the South Pacific, intending to isolate Australia and strike again at Hawaii, Coral Sea, and Midway. During the spring of 1942, U.S. forces in the Pacific finally had some success. In the Battle of the Coral Sea, May 2nd to 6th, my birthday, U.S. warplanes forced a Japanese invasion fleet headed toward the island of New Guinea to turn back after sinking an aircraft carrier and destroying 70 planes. A few weeks later, Admiral Yamamoto steered his main Japanese fleet of 86 warships and 700 warplanes toward Midway, a tiny island in the central Pacific Ocean, some 1,300 miles northwest of Honolulu, Hawaii. The Japanese hoped to launch another airstrike from Midway on Pearl Harbor. This time, however, the Japanese were the ones who were surprised. Surprise! In a crucial breakthrough, Americans had cracked the Japanese military radio code, allowing Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the U.S. Central Pacific Fleet, to learn where Yamamoto's fleet was heading. Uh-oh. The Japanese hit Midway hard on June 4th, 1942, but at the cost of about a third of their warplanes. American planes then struck back, sinking 4 of the 6 Japanese aircraft carriers that had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor. The Battle of Midway. The Battle of Midway was the first major defeat for the Japanese Navy in 350 years and a turning point of the Pacific War. The American victory blunted Japan's military momentum, eliminated the threat to Hawaii, and brought time for the United States to organize its massive industrial productivity for a wider war. General MacArthur's Pacific Strategy. American and Australian forces were greatly under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, an egotistical military genius who irritated his superiors with his unpleasant personality and constant self-promotion. MacArthur had retired in 1937 but was called back into service by mid-1941. In 1942, he assumed command of the Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific and masterminded the American effort to strike back at the Japanese. On August 7, 1942, some 19,000 Marines landed on Guadalcanal Island, where the Japanese had an air base. Savage fighting lasted through February 1943, but it resulted in the Japanese army's defeat, with a loss of 20,000 men compared to 1,752 Americans. Said a Marine, "These people refused to surrender. Another wished we were fighting against the Germans. They are human beings like us, but the Japanese are like animals." Woo! Shots fired. The suicidal intensity of the Japanese led MacArthur and Admiral Chester Nimitz to adopt a leapfrogging or island hopping strategy, whereby they liberated the most important islands and bypassed the others, leaving isolated Japanese bases to wither on the vine, as Nimitz put it. Battles of the Central Pacific. On June 15, 1944, U.S. forces liberated Tinian, Guam, and Saipan in the Mariana Islands, near the Marianas Trench. The battle for control of Saipan was one of the most brutal and deadly in the Pacific. It was strategically important because it allowed the new American B-29 Superfortress bombers to strike Japan itself. Fanatical Japanese resistance made an inferno of every beachhead as American forces assaulted the dug-in defenders. U.S. Marines and Army soldiers, including African Americans, in combat for the first time in war, were pushed to the limit. The struggle, thanks for listening, you guys. The struggle for Saipan lasted 3 weeks because the 30,000 well-prepared Japanese defenders, twice as many as the Americans expected, commanded the heights overlooking the beaches where the U.S. troops landed. As he observed the 600 American ships positioned offshore unloading U.S. Marines, a Japanese commander muttered, "Hell is upon us." But hell has no favorites. Both sides experienced hellish conflict as the invasion unfolded. A Marine officer described the 4 miles of beach where the landings occurred. All around us was the chaotic debris of bitter combat. Japanese and Marine bodies lying in mangled and grotesque positions, the acrid smell of high explosives, the shattered trees, and the churned up sand littered with discarded equipment. Once off the beach, the Americans had to slog through a brutal jungle terrain that gave the defenders a tactical advantage. Ravines, caves, cliffs, and hills earned nicknames such as Hell's Pocket, Death Valley, and Purple Heart Ridge. 5 soldiers and Marines received the Medal of Honor. Nice. The Battle of Saipan culminated on July 7th when the besieged Japanese launched the largest banzai suicide attack in the Pacific War, in which large numbers of Japanese soldiers would charge American troops in a horde-like fashion, with the officers swishing their swords over their heads, with soldiers firing rapidly behind them, shouting, "Banzai!" Every available American, whether a senior officer, cook, medic, or radio operator, grabbed a weapon to help stop the relentless assault. Japanese bodies piled up so high that the Americans had to move their machine guns to gain a field of fire. The Americans were eventually able to stand their ground and systematically kill or wound every attacker. Some 20,000 Japanese defenders were killed compared to 3,100 Americans, making Saipan the costliest campaign in the Pacific to date. But as many as 7,000 more Japanese soldiers committed suicide upon the order of their commanding general, Yoshitsugu Saito, who killed himself after being wounded. The unwanted visit. As combat involving U.S. forces in the Pacific grew more intense and widespread, casualties mounted. Families dreaded receiving the telegram or hearing the knock on the door that meant a husband or son had been killed. In January 1943, Thomas Sullivan was preparing to go to work in Waterloo, Iowa, when 3 U.S. Navy officers appeared at his door. All 5 of Sullivan's sons, George, Madison, Albert, Francis, and Joseph, had enlisted after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. They had insisted on serving on the same ship. Now, Thomas Sullivan asked the visitors which of his sons had been killed. All of them, an officer replied. Their ship, the USS Juno, had been sunk by a Japanese submarine in the Pacific. 3 Sullivan brothers had died after the initial explosion. The 2 others scrambled into life rafts but died while waiting for rescue. A new warship was named for them. Return to the Philippines. General MacArthur's forces invaded the Japanese-controlled Philippines on October 20th, 1944. The Japanese, knowing that the loss of the Philippines would cut them off from essential raw materials, brought in warships from 3 directions to defend the islands they had controlled since 1942. They were unaware that they were steaming into a carefully prepared American trap. On October 23, 1944, the jaws of the trap closed. The 4 naval and air battles fought over 3 days in the Philippine Sea, known collectively as the Battle of Leyte Gulf, marked the largest naval engagement in history and the worst Japanese defeat of the war. Some 216 U.S. warships converged to engage 64 Japanese ships. By the end of the colossal battle, 36 Japanese warships, including 4 aircraft carriers, had been destroyed. The once invincible Japanese Imperial Navy died in Leyte Gulf. As MacArthur waded ashore with the U.S. troops liberating the Philippines, he reminded reporters of his 1942 pledge, "I shall return." When he was evacuated in the face of the Japanese invasion, now he announced, "People of the Philippines, I have returned. The hour of your redemption is here. Rally to me." The massive battle featured the first Japanese kamikaze, Divine Wind, attacks in which pilots deliberately crashed their bomb-laden planes into American warships. Japanese warplanes carried only enough fuel to reach their targets. Dang. Well, from the fall of 1944 to the war's end in the summer of 1945, an estimated 4,000 kamikaze pilots died on such suicide missions. "Kamikazes just poured at us again and again," a sailor remembered. "It scared the out of us." The Battle of Okinawa. We're so almost done. The closer the Allied forces got to Japan, the fiercer the resistance they encountered. While fighting continued in the Philippines, 30,000 U.S. Marines landed on Iwo Jima, a volcanic atoll, atoll, a volcanic atoll 760 miles from Tokyo, which the Americans wanted as an airbase for fighter planes to escort bombers over Japan. It took almost 6 weeks to secure the tiny island at a cost of nearly 7,000 American lives and 21,000 of the 22,000 Japanese soldiers. In the end, the airbase never materialized. The assault on Okinawa was even bloodier. Only 360 miles from the main Japanese islands, Okinawa was strategically important because it would serve as the staging area for the planned the planned Allied invasion of Japan. The conquest of Okinawa was the largest amphibious operation of the Pacific War, involving some 300,000 troops and requiring almost 3 months of brutal fighting. More than 150,000 Japanese were killed, some 49,000 Americans were killed, wounded, or missing. A 35% casualty rate. A third of U.S. pilots and a quarter of submarines lost their lives. Preparation for the invasion of Japan. As the fighting raged on Okinawa, Allied commanders began planning Operation Downfall, the invasion of Japan itself. The Japanese government had mobilized millions of civilians into a national militia to defend the home islands. What they did not know was that military leaders intended to use them in a human kamikaze effort to weaken Japanese defenses, destroy their war-related industries, and erode civilian morale. The Allied command stepped up bombing raids in the summer of 1944. Then in early 1945, General Curtis LeMay, head of the U.S. Bomber Command, ordered devastating firebomb raids upon Japanese cities. Bomb and burn them till they quit. On March 9th, some 300 B-29 bombers dropped napalm bombs on Tokyo. The attack incinerated 16 square miles of the city and killed some 100,000 people while rendering 1 million people homeless. By then, American military leaders had lost all moral qualms about targeting Japanese civilians. The kamikaze attacks, the Japanese savagery towards prisoners of war, the burning of Manila that killed 100,000 civilians, and the brutal treatment of Chinese civilians had eroded almost all sympathy. By August 1945, 66 Japanese cities had been firebombed. Secretary of War Henry Stimson called the lack of public outcry in the United States over the raids appalling. The atomic bomb. Still, Japanese military leaders preferred national suicide over surrender. In early 1945, Harry S. Truman, the vice president who became president upon Roosevelt's death on April 12th, learned of the first successful test of an atomic bomb in New Mexico. Now that military planners knew the bomb would work, they selected 2 Japanese cities as targets. The first was Hiroshima, a port city and army headquarters in southern Japan. On July 25, 1945, Truman, who knew nothing about the devastating effects of radiation poisoning, ordered that the atomic bomb be dropped if Japan did not surrender before August 3rd. Although an intense debate emerged over the decision, General Eisenhower argued that the Japanese were ready for surrender, and he hated to see our country be the first to use such a weapon. Truman later recalled, "We faced half a million casualties trying to take Japan by land. It was either that or the atom bomb. And I didn't hesitate a minute, and I've never lost any sleep over it since." To Truman and others, the use of atomic bombs seemed a logical next step to end the war. Some 85% of Americans surveyed agreed with the decision to use atomic bombs. As it turned out, scientists greatly underestimated the bomb's power. Their prediction that 20,000 people would be killed proved much too low. In mid-July 1945, the Allied leaders met in Potsdam, Germany, near Berlin. Joseph Stalin demanded, according to Truman, that the United States and Great Britain recognize the new puppet governments the Soviets had created in Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary. Truman responded that the United States would do so only after the Soviets allowed free access to them and adopted democratic processes. Until that happened, America would veto efforts to allow such Soviet-dominated nations to participate in the new United Nations. The conference deadlocked over the issue of Soviet control in Eastern Europe. The Allies did issue the Potsdam Declaration, which demanded that Japan surrender by August 3rd or face prompt and utter destruction. Truman left Potsdam optimistic about post-war relations with the Soviet Union. "I can deal with Stalin," he wrote. "He is honest but smart as hell." Truman would soon change his mind about Stalin's honesty. The deadline calling for Japan's surrender passed, and on August 6, 1945, a B-29 bomber, piloted by Colonel Paul Tibbets, the plane was named Enola Gay after Tibbets' mother, took off at 2 a.m. from the island of Tinian, headed for Hiroshima. At 8:15, flying at 31,600 feet, the bombardier aboard the Enola Gay released the 5-ton, 10-foot-long uranium bomb nicknamed Little Boy. 43 seconds later, the bomb exploded at an altitude of 1,900 feet, creating a blinding flash of light followed by a firewall towering 40,000 feet. The tail gunner of the Enola Gay described the scene. "It's like bubbling molasses down there. The mushroom is spreading out. Fires are springing up everywhere. It's like a peep into hell." The bomb's shock wave and firestorm initially killed some 78,000 people, including thousands of Japanese soldiers and 23 American prisoners of war. By the end of the year, the death toll would reach 140,000, as more people died of injuries or radiation poisoning. In addition, the bomb destroyed 76,000 buildings. Dang. President Truman was returning from the Potsdam Conference when news arrived that the atomic bomb had been dropped. "This is the greatest thing in history," he repeatedly exclaimed. In the United States, Americans greeted the news with similar joy. "No tears of sympathy will be shed in America for the Japanese people," the Omaha World Herald predicted. Had they possessed a comparable weapon at Pearl Harbor, would they have hesitated to use it? Others reacted by pointing to the implications of atomic warfare. Yesterday, journalist Hanson Baldwin wrote in the New York Times, "We clinched victory in the Pacific, but we sowed the whirlwind." 2 days after the Hiroshima bombing, an opportunistic Soviet Union entered the war in the Pacific by sending hundreds of thousands of troops into Japanese-occupied Manchuria along the border between China and the Soviet Union. Truman and his aides, frustrated by the refusal of Japanese leaders to surrender and fearful that the Soviet Union's entry would complicate negotiations, ordered a second atomic bomb, Fat Man, to be dropped. The aftermath of Little Boy. A photograph of the wasteland that remained after the atomic bomb Little Boy decimated Hiroshima, Japan on August 6, 1945. On August 9th, the city of Nagasaki, a shipbuilding center, experienced the same nuclear devastation that had destroyed Hiroshima. An estimated 71,000 people were killed in the city of some 240,000 residents. Although Japanese military leaders wanted to fight on, the emperor decided that defending the homeland against such ghastly new bombs was impossible, and he ordered the military government to surrender. The formal surrender ceremony occurred on an American warship in Tokyo Bay on September 2nd, 1945. A date quickly known as VJ Day. Bombing of Nagasaki. A 20,000 foot tall mushroom cloud shrouded the city of Nagasaki following the atomic bombing on August 9th, 1945. A new age is born. The Second World War. This is going to be interesting stuff, guys. So you guys have stayed till the end. This is your gift, basically. It's such a good one. That's strange. The Second World War was the costliest conflict in terms of human life and property destroyed in history. The Soviet Union suffered 20 million deaths, China 10 million, Germany 5.6 million, and Japan 2.3 million. The United States suffered 292,000 battle deaths and 114,000 non-combat deaths in proportion to its population. However, the United States suffered far fewer losses than did the other Allied nations or their enemies. For every American killed in the Second World War, for example, some 59 Soviets died. The war was the pivotal event of the turbulent 20th century. It engulfed 5 continents, leveled cities, reshaped entire societies, transformed international relations, and destroyed German and Italian fascism, as well as Japanese militarism. It set in motion the fall of China to communism in 1949 and the outbreak of the Korean War a year later. The colonial empires in America and Asia, governed by European nations, rapidly crumbled as the changes wrought by the war unleashed independence movements. In 1947, for example, the new nations of India and Pakistan liberated themselves from British control. The Soviet Union emerged as a new global superpower, while the United States, as Winston Churchill told the House of Commons, stood at the summit of the world. Why did the Allies win? Many factors contributed to the Allied victory in the Second World War. The American and British leaders, Roosevelt and Churchill, were better at coordinating military efforts and maintaining national morale than were Hitler, Mussolini, and the Japanese Emperor Hirohito. By 1944, Hitler had grown increasingly unstable and unpredictable in his decision-making, and more withdrawn from the German people, especially after a failed attempt by high-ranking officers to assassinate him that July by placing a bomb under his desk. The blast shattered Hitler's eardrums, riddled his body with wooden splinters, and caused a nervous breakdown that left him paranoid, anxious, and addicted to cocaine injections. In the end, however, what turned the tide was the awesome productivity of American industry and the ability of the Soviet Union to absorb the massive German invasion and push the Nazis back all the way to Berlin. By the end of the war, Japan had run out of food and Germany had run out of fuel. By contrast, the United States was churning out more of everything. As early as 1942, just a few weeks after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, Fritz Todt, a Nazi engineer, told Hitler that the war against the United States was already lost because of America's ability to outproduce all other warring nations combined. The transformation of American life. The war transformed American life by ending the Great Depression and launching a period of unprecedented prosperity. Big businesses during the war grew into gigantic corporations as they benefited from huge government contracts for military weapons, equipment, and supplies. New technologies and products developed for military purposes. Radars, computers, electronics, plastics, and synthetics, jet engines, rockets, atomic energy began to transform the private sector, as did new consumer products resulting from war-related innovations, and new opportunities for women as well as for African Americans. Mexican Americans and other minorities set in motion major social changes that would culminate in the civil rights movement and the feminist movement 2 decades later. The expansion of the federal government, spurred by the war effort, continued after 1945. Presidential authority increased enormously at the expense of congressional and state power. The isolationist sentiment in foreign relations that had been so powerful in the 1920s and 1930s evaporated as the United States assumed new global responsibilities and economic interests. In August 1945, President Truman told the nation that the United States had emerged from this war the most powerful nation in this world, the most powerful nation perhaps in all history. But the Soviet Union, despite its profound human losses and physical destruction, had gained much new territory, built massive armed forces, and enhanced its international influence, making it the greatest power in Europe and Asia, a little over a century after Frenchman Alexis de Tocqueville had predicted that Europe would eventually be overshadowed by the United States and Russia. His prophecy had come to pass. That's that. Moving on to part 7. Yay. Next chapter. Got a little intro here. Next chapter is called The Cold War and the Fair Deal, 1945 to 1952. Interesting. Moving along. I'm so excited. Yay. Thanks for reading with me, you guys. I have 5 minutes before class begins. Woohoo!